All right, so I'm very happy to say hi to everyone, and I'm also very happy to introduce Professor Stephen Gaukroger, who is a professor emeritus at University of Sydney, where he has taught history of philosophy and history of science for a long time. And I think I'm going to keep the biography short here because there's just too much to say. Stephen Gaukroger has won numerous awards and a couple of medals for his work, which consists of 14 books and a few more edited volumes. And very noticeable and notable was most recently a quadrilogy of books that concerned the rise and interconnection of science and civilization from 1210 to 1935. And this last book was an essay about the failures of philosophy, which came out in 2020. That being said, Stephen, we are very happy to have you here and to start off this lecture series. We are very grateful for you to start this very early in the morning, because for you it's still early in the day. And I don't have anything more to add. Please go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Ansgar. And am I loud enough for everyone? I'm picking up the volume? Yeah, good. And also, of course, thanks for the other participants, though some of you up late at night. This is very much work in progress, and I want to focus on a couple of issues, or that's to say, the paper will bring out a couple of issues that I'm concerned with, that are of general interest, I hope. One is the shift from something in a political and social register to something in intellectual history, how one actually makes that shift. And I'll indicate early in the paper why that can be a problematic shift, but why it needs to be done. That's a historiographical question. The second question is a more philosophical question, and it's deeply implicated in the question, in the issue of the Peace of Westphalia. Basically, if one's committed to pluralism in the political realm, does this translate into anything in intellectual history? And in particular, how does one distinguish pluralism and relativism in intellectual history? Now, I think this is a philosophical problem. It's a deep problem, but it's something that we all need to come to terms with in pursuing intellectual history. Okay, let me start. Well, the program for the seminar series, Philosophy in Times of Crisis, points out, and I quote, "Crises in society can lead to crises within philosophy. Concepts and normative principles that were taken for granted suddenly require critical reevaluation and become the center of attention." The problem for intellectual history is that, obvious as the social and political crises are, identifying the concepts and normative principles affected is not always easy. And underlying this is an issue of what we might refer to as commensurability. How is it possible to think through the move from socio-political events to philosophically formulated sets of values? So that's the kind of big philosophical issue that underlies the issues that I'll be talking about. Sometimes this transition has been made in a very reckless fashion. There's no doubt about that. So, for example, what I remember as a vogue in the 1960s for associating the advocacy of atomism in natural philosophy in mid-17th century England with the development of a radical democratic individualist political notions at the time of the English Civil War. A lot of people were making that kind of connection in the 60s and perhaps early 70s. As if the atomization of society and the atomization of matter were part of the same general phenomenon. And of course, with hindsight, it's ridiculous. The cases of this kind, which basically work on free association rather than any scholarship, might discourage one from any attempt to explore a connection between social events and intellectual movements. But it shouldn't, because there's other cases where one has to make this kind of connection. So, continuing my introductory remarks, consider a development at the other end of the spectrum, as it were, the promotion of a democratic conception of knowledge in the revolutionary turmoil in France in the last decades of the 18th century. In the politically charged atmosphere of late 18th century Paris, the questioning of scientific authority was something that motivated the move to revolutionary politics. And a number of those associated with unorthodox scientific and medical systems became prominent revolutionaries, with one of the chief aims being the dismantling of the autocratic organization of scientific inquiry. The Académie des Sciences, with the support of the government, who'd set up the academy in the first place, was accused of trying to circumscribe science so as to make it entirely a matter for professionals. The only way to fight this was to appeal to the public. Bissot de Warville put the argument in these terms, and I quote, he writes, "The ancients never imagined any institution so bizarre as our academies. Neither in Athens nor in Rome does one find those who have certification as philosophers. To enter the school of Chrysippus or that of Epicurus, it wasn't necessary to take a ballot or have a vote. The empire of the sciences should have nothing to do with despots, aristocrats, or electors. Its image is that of a perfect republic in which the most useful talent is the sole entitlement to honor. To admit a despot or aristocrats or electors officially empowered to set the seal of certification on works of genius is to violate the natural order and the liberty of the human mind. It's a crime against public opinion, which alone has the right to crown genius. It introduces an outrageous despotism, making each elector a tyrant and turning back all other savants into slaves. In debasing the nobility of minds, it holds back the perfection of science and prejudices the search for truth." Okay, well, I don't think there can be any doubt that knowledge claims here are firmly embedded in an identifiable political context. But the connection is an extremely difficult one to come to terms with. Is a democratic conception of the political realm simply transferable to the intellectual realm, as perhaps anti-vaxxers, anti-vaccination spokespeople in our own time would urge? And if not, why not? Even more problematically, what's the distinction between pluralism and relativism, and how can it be applied? Well, these are philosophical problems, and I don't think they're at all easy to deal with. While it won't lead to their resolution, some help can perhaps be gleaned by tracing them back to earlier events in early modern European culture. These are events that I suggest give rise to them, or at least to their forebears. And I'm referring to the 30 Years' War, fought between 1618 and 1648. This was one of the most destructive wars in human history, the culmination of 100 years of wars of religion that had effectively begun in the middle decades of the 16th century. These were wars that, for their combatants, took the form of an uncompromising struggle between Christ and Antichrist, between God and the devil. The 30 Years' War devastated much of the European landscape. It posed deadly threats to civilians as well as soldiers through famine, fighting, and disease, and it resulted in millions of deaths, with some areas of the German landmass experiencing a loss of 2/3 of their population. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia set out to resolve the tensions by decisively rejecting the idea of a universal monarchy and recognizing politically autonomous states within the Holy Roman Empire. In the wake of the treaty, a great deal of attention was paid to how confessional conflicts could be avoided. The wars of religion, as Mark Greengrass puts it, I quote, were political contentions in which religion was the way in which conflicts in the commonwealth of state and church were manifested. The divisions over religious beliefs and practices were polymorphic and unpredictable, a cause and consequence of religion becoming a central dynamic in public and private affairs. Virulent doctrinal and dogmatic conflicts took on new forms, often concentrating on where the true church was to be found. Armed conflicts descended into civil wars, iconoclastic uprisings, local civil disorders, noble-led rebellions, and peasant revolts. Well, in the light of these developments, it was no longer clear that Christendom embodied shared values. This had a direct bearing on philosophy, because philosophy was the intellectual standard bearer of Christianity at this time. It was in the Christianized metaphysics of the 16th and 17th centuries that the values of Christianity were defended and rationalized. In response to these desperate circumstances, a new strategy was required, one with potentially radical consequences for political authority and for the authority of metaphysics. The project of the Peace of Westphalia was not to try to resurrect some supposed common values of Christendom, but to put a number of compromises in place. And there were two contrasting types of reaction to this, and this now is the core of my talk. The first kind of reaction was to construe the compromises as a purely pragmatic temporary measure or set of measures to be replaced ultimately by a truly universal set of values. This was the metaphysical route. Now, at first sight, metaphysics looks like an unpromising entry point into Enlightenment thought. In his study of French higher education in the 17th and 18th centuries, for example, Brockless notes that teachers of metaphysics did little more than provide a commentary on authoritative texts, using well-worn and second-hand exegetical arguments that inevitably led to politically and religiously safe conclusions. New philosophical ideas were largely judged a nuisance, the creation of outsiders that had to be destroyed or neutralized. By contrast, new developments in natural philosophy, particularly astronomy and mechanics, while certainly meeting resistance in educational institutions, fared somewhat better, despite offering a more obvious challenge to traditional church teaching. But there were intimate connections between natural philosophy and metaphysics. And Descartes, for example, stressed the importance of metaphysics for his extremely influential natural philosophy. Some of his followers, most notably Regius, proposed to develop this natural philosophy by cutting back Cartesian metaphysics, while others, notably Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz, focused on the metaphysical program, integrating a mechanist natural philosophy into metaphysics. Enlightenment metaphysics, that is, a metaphysics informed by, in certain respects, also rationalizing new developments in the natural sciences, replaced scholastic metaphysics for many. But the two shared a certain fundamental conception of inquiry, dictated by the very nature of metaphysics. And this is as true of Spinoza as it is of Leibniz and Malebranche. The idea was that there could be a universal set of values, just what scholastic metaphysics had aimed at, and that this universal set of values could be established through reflection on the ultimate aims of human life. Well, to appreciate the importance of developments in metaphysics and to grasp, I think, just what was at stake, we need to understand what the issues in scholastic metaphysics were and why it was a reform of metaphysics that was pursued. That is, why metaphysics was not just abandoned in favor of something new, such as the Dutch Cartesians were advocating. In particular, we need to understand the ability of metaphysics to offer a comprehensive account that had an impact on and made sense of every aspect of one's life. This was the claim and the attraction of metaphysics. Metaphysics appeared indispensable because, at least in principle, it connected and provided a rationale for everything that one knew and believed. In this respect, the metaphysical systems of the late 17th and early 18th centuries not only took over the aspirations of scholastic metaphysics that they sought to replace, but exhibited fundamental continuities with scholastic metaphysics, despite the occasional radical gloss. The metaphysical systems of the Enlightenment then set out in their various different ways to establish and refine the universality of reason, sometimes with a view to reforming and bolstering Christianity, as in Malebranche and Leibniz, but increasingly with a view to replacing it as a moral and political guide, and Spinoza is the obvious example here. Yet the question arises whether, in the latter cases, it was just a matter of substituting the secular for the religious. The secular simply occupying the space vacated by the religious, as if everything that fell under religion could now be transferred to the secular realm. You just move it over from one set of constraints to another. If this is the case, if there's no recognition of a transformation in or a need for the transformation in the nature of the tasks, then all we have is a change of management. And I think that's generally true of the shift from scholastic to Enlightenment metaphysics. In terms of the questions asked and the needs, it's simply a change of management. It's not the radical move that it's often made out to be. Consider this in the context of the wars of religion. The political, social, and moral doctrines of scholastic philosophy in its various forms had done nothing to prevent or ameliorate the wars of religion. This was recognized on all sides by the second half of the 17th century, including advocates of metaphysics. And the replacement of scholastic metaphysics by Enlightenment metaphysics was prompted by these worries, by the uselessness, if you like, of scholastic metaphysics in dealing with these major issues. But if it does, in fact, come down simply to a change in management, is there then any hope for any of the new metaphysical systems? Are they actually going to be able to achieve something that scholastic metaphysics had been unable to achieve? In contrast with these developments in the course of the Enlightenment, the idea that metaphysics was the key to understanding the nature of the physical and human worlds was abandoned on a number of fronts. Philosophical reflection, traditionally understood as something that provided a comprehensive, systematic overview, was replaced by new forms of understanding, in the belief that these engaged the problems that metaphysics had set out to deal with, but treated them in a more satisfactory fashion. Replacement by these new forms of understanding came to a head in the middle of the 18th century. But a dissatisfaction with metaphysics as a master discipline can be traced to the 17th century, above all to the Peace of Westphalia. Challenges to the idea that the solution lay in a reformed metaphysics came from a number of sources in the middle decades of the 17th century, some explicit, some implicit. None of these derived from within metaphysics itself. It was not a question of internally generated challenges, but of developments that had previously been marginal to metaphysical thinking. The most striking explicit challenge arose in the wake of the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Westphalia sought to resolve the religious tensions that had underlain the war by desacralizing the state, in an effort to move confessional claims out of the public realm into a private space. The separation of politics and religious morality prompted a rethinking of the nature of morality. Leibniz, for example, sought a metaphysical reconciliation of the two, reinstituting reason as the universal arbiter. For Pufendorf and Thomasius, by contrast, in the period of confessional conflict, as Ian Hunter notes, the period of confessional conflict was something quite other than a theatre of the intellect in which reason could display its transcendence of historical conditions and passions. It was instead a theatre of social warfare, fueled in part by a reason whose passion for transcendence made its claims non-negotiable. Pufendorf and Thomasius rejected the search for a non-negotiable set of universal values on the basis that it was non-negotiable principles masquerading as universal values that had prompted the confessional conflicts in the first place. Accordingly, it was urged, the aim should be to keep the sides apart by building on the compromises, with a view to removing religious issues from the political realm, keeping the latter resolutely secular. Now, a core issue here is the nature of the values that regulated behavior, and above all, the question of what the legitimacy of these values consisted in. The divide was along the lines of a rationalist metaphysics of morals, as opposed to an understanding of morality in terms of office. That's to say, the responsibility and duties that follow from one's social standing or occupation or role, a notion that goes back to Cicero. On this latter conception, morality is in large part a function of satisfying the responsibilities of one's occupation, rank, office, or standing. The soldier, the ruler, the head of the household, the mother, the advocate, the teacher, the priest, the monk, the hero, each had different sets of responsibilities, which may conflict with one another, and accordingly elicited very different expectations with regard to behavior. The ethics of office was far from being a novel development in the mid-17th century, and it had been presented in a canonical, an intriguing form in Cicero. It was, I believe, the standard way of thinking about values before the upheavals of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in the 16th century. This is what I'm currently working on, the way in which the ethics of office became transformed in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation back to the idea that morality consisted in some universal set of values. It was the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, I would argue, I'm not going to argue it here, but I would argue that prompted the move away from the notion of office to what might be considered a more centralized system of values derived from a set of beliefs. In its post-Westphalia reincarnation, the ethics of office took on new roles and drew on notions of tolerance that would earlier have been quite alien. It was now in conflict with a religious conception of ultimate values. And this had not been the case earlier. As Mark Greengrass notes, toleration was not what had been expected of a Christian magistrate, still less a minister of the word. Luther introduced the word into the German vocabulary, only to dismiss what it implied. A magistrate was no more expected to tolerate the existence of another religion than to permit the existence of demonic forces and witchcraft. The objection to the idea of an ethics of office in its new incarnation was that it was something that was not grounded in a universal system of values, and so was a kind of morality of convenience. As Kant put it in Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, becoming virtuous on this conception does not require a change of heart, but only one of habits. And I quote, "A human being here considers himself virtuous whenever he feels himself stable in his maxims of observance to duty, though not by virtue of a supreme ground of all maxims, namely duty, but when, for instance, an immoderate human being converts to moderation for the sake of health, a liar to truth for the sake of reputation, an unjust human being to civic righteousness for the sake of peace or profit, etc., all in conformity with the prized principle of happiness." Well, at the same time, it was considered that an ethics of office legitimated moral diversity bordering on relativism, and that it encouraged the replacement of ethical principles by casuistry. One way in which one might consider the difference here is lying in a conflict between religious values and secular ones. But I think this is unproductive to think of it in these terms. There are problems of thinking of the division in this way. Lutheranism, for example, in its rejection of an ecclesiastical hierarchy, had moved many questions of religious authority into the secular realm. A more serviceable distinction is that in terms of beliefs versus social responsibilities. What guides behavior? Should it be one's beliefs or should it be one's social responsibilities? It's beliefs that underpin the rationalist metaphysics of morality, whereas offices depend on social responsibilities. Beliefs may be irreconcilable, but responsibilities of office may also conflict. But to the extent that beliefs aim at truth, and to the extent to which there are no degrees of truth, there is no flexibility once beliefs have been formed and commitments made. Whereas there may be significant variation, not only in the responsibilities of office, but in the nature of the offices themselves. The worry that an ethics of office may invite relativism was one that its advocates were well aware of. And I want to consider briefly some of the responses. Pufendorf himself has often been placed at the origins of one of these, one more usually associated with later Enlightenment thought. This turns on the idea that selfish needs have been transformed in the transition from a simple world into one with a significant degree of interdependency. The historical angle is a new and radical one, I think. The argument might be put in these terms. The uniform set of Christian virtues, humility, charity, chastity, gratitude, temperance, patience, diligence, the uniform set of Christian virtues may have been enough to regulate simple, relatively homogeneous forms of society, but they become increasingly beside the point as highly differentiated forms of society emerge in the modern era. Their different virtues need to start matching social roles in which one may face all kinds of unforeseen complexities. This is my gloss on Pufendorf's argument. It's not that the Christian virtues were rejected, but rather that they were no longer able to play the role for which they were devised. Something more fine-tuned and flexible is needed. Incidentally, I've just been reading Cicero De Officiis, and this is exactly what Cicero argues, in a different context, of course. Well, as far as Pufendorf's response is concerned, there's also a second consideration. He's a Protestant. Medieval Catholic culture had some degree of differentiation of roles, but these tended to be conceived in terms of a hierarchy, especially a religious hierarchy or a religiously motivated hierarchy. While Catholics insisted on the need for a priesthood and clerical hierarchy, for example, Luther rejected the notion that the spiritual estate was superior to the temporal estates, such as the aristocracy and the laity. And he regarded the clerical office as just one office amongst others. In other words, there's a leveling of offices. And in these circumstances, an ethics of office would seem far more appropriate than a top-down system of values. While there was a hierarchy, the idea of a general system of values that has universal application looked plausible. But once there's simply a collection of offices requiring very different kinds of behavior from the office holders, just think of the soldier, the mother, the theologian, then a single system becomes much less viable. Okay, the question now arises, where does one draw the line? The Treaty of Westphalia, in recognizing politically autonomous states, in effect recognized politically autonomous confessions. Because what marked these states out, and what had caused the problems in the first place, was their different confessions. But what about confessions within a state? Even Spinoza believed that, at least in principle, order in a state could only be achieved through adherence to a single confession. He realized pragmatically this wasn't always possible, but he thought that in principle, this is what you needed for stability in a state, enforcement of a single confession. But of course, this may prove to be impossible, because what one is expected to adhere to can change radically on a number of occasions over a short space of time. Here's Locke, for example. I quote, "Our modern English history affords us fresh examples in the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth, how easily and smoothly the clergy changed their decrees, their articles of faith, their form of worship, everything according to the inclination of those kings and queens. Yet were those kings and queens of such different mind in point of religion, and enjoying thereupon such different things, that no man in his wits, I had almost said none but an atheist, will presume to say that any sincere and upright worshipper of God could, with safe conscience, obey their several decrees." And the situation is complicated, of course, particularly in Locke, by the appearance of travel reports from the East in the New World from the 16th century onwards, reports that catalogue a huge spectrum of human behavior and habits. These developments, political and geographical, came to a head at the end of the 17th century in Locke and Bale. What's ultimately at stake is the pressing question of human diversity, particularly social and moral diversity. Is such diversity something to be overcome by attempting to bring it under universal metaphysical principles? Or does it provide us with an entry into the investigation of the way in which mentalities are shaped by the social and natural conditions in which one finds oneself? Locke used travel accounts to establish the intractable reality of moral diversity, something quite at odds with the idea that morality was or could be or should be regulated by a universal set of values established by reason. Accordingly, the claims of rational metaphysics began to look as parochial as those of scholastic metaphysics had. At the same time, Bayle was refusing to make any concessions to the genre of sacred history. In his writings on religion, although occasionally critical of Christianity, he also introduces a posture of standing back from Christianity, considering it as an object of study without making any assumptions as to the validity of its claims to truth. This posed a novel threat to the standing of Christianity, a threat all the more dangerous because it was indirect. Theologians had stock answers to the various forms of atheism. But the idea that there was a way of considering Christian teaching while bracketing off the question of its truth was utterly novel and especially shocking. Nor is it just Christianity that was in question, as Hume showed when he applied the same approach to metaphysics. That is, considering it without taking into account whether its claims were true or false, simply a more phenomenological investigation of the discipline. Locke and Bayle initiated a tradition that shaped moral and religious thinking over the next 60 years. In the case of morality, culminating in its most radical form in Montesquieu's claim in his De l'Esprit des Lois of 1748, that different moral principles may be appropriate for different kinds of society. And in the case of religion, in Picard's Cérémonies et Coutumes Religieuses of 1723-37, which transformed belief in one unique, absolute and God-given truth, transformed it into individual ceremonies and customs that reflected the truths relative to each people and culture, effectively making the sacred specific to time, space, and institutions. These developments set the scene for a number of outright rejections of the aspirations of metaphysics in the middle of the 18th century, and in the replacement of metaphysics. These replacements are quite different from one another, reflecting differences in national expectations. That's to say, the rejections of metaphysics were designed to meet different expectations raised in different cultures. There was no uniform expectation. For Hume in Scotland, the association of metaphysics and religion enabled him to use tools developed in the inquiry into religion, which had become tools that had become commonplace, in a parallel but novel inquiry into metaphysics. Above all, he was able to argue that metaphysics, unable to control its abstractions and unconstrained by common sense, was a self-defeating enterprise. In France, by contrast, where there remained a concern with a philosophical defense of personal immortality, it was the abstract way in which metaphysics investigated the core question of the relation between mind and body that was faulted. In particular, medicine had uncovered many psychosomatic and somatopsychic relations and had considered not the wholly abstract mind of metaphysics, but minds in healthy and sick states, and their relations to bodies in healthy and sick states. For the French médecin philosophe, to understand the relation between mind and body one needed to understand the person. Again, this is a claim in Cicero I'm reading. A person, yeah, the problem with the kind of rationalist metaphysics of the Stoics is that they think that human beings are just minds, they're minds and bodies. You need to take bodies into account. Again, this issue's coming up. One needs to understand the relation between mind and body to understand the person in sickness and in health, not the abstractions of philosophy. It's in a new version, but it's not a completely novel consideration. Finally, in the Germanophone world, a contrast is drawn between the systematic metaphysics or Schulphilosophy of the followers of Christian Wolff, typified for its critics in Stubengelehrte, the antisocial and argumentative learned man who spends all his time alone in his study. Contrast between such people and the advocates of popular philosophy. By contrast with the academic nature of metaphysics, popular philosophy aimed not at the training of an academic audience, which was considered too parochial a role for philosophy, but the cultural and ethical cultivation of members of the educated classes, where the means of cultivation lay in areas such as history, aesthetics, pedagogy, with a strong commitment to literary culture, broad learning, and the art of conversation. It was how to live one's life, the aims of ancient philosophy, that was at stake here, and metaphysics had nothing to offer. In short, there's a resolute pluralism in 18th century rejections of metaphysics. Why? Because the point of the exercise differs in each case. You couldn't have anything but pluralism. These are different exercises. They're all anti-metaphysics. They're all saying we're doing something that metaphysics can't do, but the areas in which they're doing it are not can't be assimilated to the universal values of metaphysics. Once one abandons the idea that a single conception is needed, there's no longer any rationale for conflating pluralism with relativism. Of course, beginning with Kant, the idea of a single conception is resurrected. But this, I suggest, should be read as the end of Enlightenment, not a new development in it, and certainly not the culmination of Enlightenment thought that it's often considered to be. Thank you.